On the night of September 21st, 2013, 39-year-old Joe Connell clinked his fork against a champagne glass to get the attention of his friends and family, who were sitting together on a restaurant patio in Wilmington, Delaware. Everyone at the large table quieted down as Joe stood up and raised his glass. He looked over at his wife Olga sitting right by him, and he smiled at her. Then he cleared his throat and made a toast. He said that he still couldn't believe that he'd been lucky enough to meet and marry a beautiful, brilliant woman like Olga. And he was so excited to be there with the people they loved to wish her a happy 39th birthday. Everyone at the table shouted happy birthday, toasted Olga, and then drank their champagne. Olga blushed, and Joe laughed a bit. He knew how shy his wife could be when the attention was on her. But he sat down and put his arm around her and told her that she deserved all the attention. After all, this was her special day. A few minutes later, as the group was talking and eating, Joe felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw there was a text message. He read it, then quickly replied, and then jumped back into the conversation at the table. But pretty much right away, loud music began playing from inside the restaurant, and Olga immediately got excited. The music meant that the dance floor in this large restaurant and bar was now open, and the dance floor was one of the big reasons they'd chosen this place to celebrate here in the first place. Because as shy as Olga was in a lot of social situations, she actually loved to let loose and dance. And so Joe instinctively stood up, looked over at his wife and took her hand, and then together they walked inside the restaurant. Once inside, they immediately hit the dance floor, and for a minute, Joe just stood there watching his wife dance. She had beautiful blonde hair, she was wearing a nice dress, and she had on sparkling pieces of expensive jewelry. Joe had meant every word in his short birthday toast. He really couldn't believe how lucky he was to be married to this woman. The couple had met online about 3 years earlier, when Joe was just coming out of the craziest and most difficult period of his life. Joe had gotten into this drunken brawl and ended up pulling out a gun, and the police got involved. Joe had said the gun was not loaded, but that event still had landed Joe in prison for almost 6 years. And when he'd gotten out, he'd vowed to clean up his life. And pretty quickly after getting out, 2 things made that possible. 1, he'd become co-owner of an auto repair shop with his best friend Chris, and 2, he'd met Olga. Joe and Olga had gotten along right away, and so they quickly set up a date. And as soon as they hung out in person, Joe thought Olga was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and one of the smartest people he'd ever met. Olga had grown up in Russia, and while she was there, she'd received college degrees in physics and chemistry. Now, Joe never thought of himself as being a particularly smart guy. He thought he was just a really good car mechanic. But Olga, she fell for him the same way he fell for her. She thought he was funny and outgoing, and it didn't hurt that she thought he was handsome and in great shape. And so, not long after their initial meeting, they moved in together, and then eventually, in June of 2013, they got married, just a few months before Olga's 39th birthday. Back on the dance floor, Joe shouted over the loud music and told his wife how amazing she looked tonight. Olga wrapped her arms around his neck, and they started dancing together. And before they knew it, hours had flown by. The dance floor had all but cleared, and the restaurant staff was now starting to shut things down for the night. Joe and Olga said goodbye to the few friends who'd stayed to dance with them, and then they too left the restaurant. On the drive home, Joe and Olga talked and laughed, still wired from their night out. But at one point, Joe got this sad look on his face, and Olga asked if something was wrong. Joe shook his head and said he was just sorry that his little sister Kelly hadn't been at the party. Olga didn't say it, but she knew that Kelly hadn't just missed the party. Kelly had not been invited. Because Joe and his younger sister were in the middle of a full-on feud, and they had completely stopped talking to each other. And as much as it upset Joe not to have Kelly in his life anymore, he could not bring himself to reconcile with her. But Olga didn't want anything to spoil her perfect birthday, so she quickly changed the subject. And within a few minutes, Joe was laughing again. Around 1:30 a.m., Joe pulled his car into a parking spot in front of his and Olga's condo. Olga got out of the car and headed down the walkway towards their front door. Joe moved kind of slowly and trailed behind her. Olga pulled her keys out of her purse, and right as she was about to unlock the door, she heard a strange noise coming from behind her. Not long after that, Officer Kelly Richards of the Newcastle County Police Department got out of her cruiser and headed up the walkway towards Joe and Olga's condo. Just a few minutes earlier, emergency dispatch had been flooded with calls from people in the surrounding condos saying they had just heard gunshots, and one caller had been sure he could see a body. Richards was the first cop on the scene, but she saw paramedics crouched down by the front door of the condo, furiously trying to help someone who was on the ground. Richards approached, and she saw there was an unconscious blonde woman in a dress laying there. Blood was pouring from the woman's cheek and head onto the concrete, and Richards thought it looked like she'd been shot. The woman was still breathing though, but just barely. Richards saw there was a ring with several diamonds in it on the woman's finger. So Richards' first thought was that the attacker must not have been here to rob this woman. Officer Richards saw more paramedics rushing down the walkway with a gurney, so she moved out of the way. But as Richards watched the paramedics wheel this woman to a nearby ambulance, she realized something strange. Richards knew this woman. Suddenly, Officer Richards looked around and really took in the condo and the surrounding area, and then it hit her. This woman, who was being rushed to the hospital, was Olga Connell. Less than 2 months earlier, Officer Richards had worked a burglary case at this condo because someone had broken in and stolen a bunch of Olga's expensive jewelry. Just then, Richards heard cars screech to a stop in the parking lot, and it sort of snapped her out of her daze. She saw several police officers coming her way, looking at her expectantly, and she told them they needed to do a sweep of the area. And it didn't take long before Richards heard one of the officers calling her name. She saw the officer crouching down near some bushes a few yards away from the front door, and so Richards walked over and joined the officer. And there, half hidden by the bushes, she saw the body of a man who had been shot multiple times, and it was clear he was already dead. Officer Richards knelt down and shined her flashlight to get a clear look at the man's face, and right away, she recognized him too. This was Olga's husband, Joe. Officer Richards had met with him several times during that burglary investigation. Around this time, Officer Richards looked over and saw the lead investigator, Detective Jamie Leonard, getting out of his car. Richards got up and walked over to him, but before she could say anything, Detective Leonard told her that he'd just gotten news that the woman who'd been found at the scene here had died on the way to the hospital. So they were now dealing with what looked like a double homicide. Officer Richards said she knew both victims. Their names were Olga and Joe Connell, and their condo had actually been robbed back in July. But Richards said that wasn't all. While the police had never arrested anyone in connection with that robbery, Joe Connell had suspected he knew who robbed them. And police had even interviewed this person. It was Joe's own little sister, Kelly. That afternoon, Detective Leonard sat at his desk looking over crime scene photos, waiting for Joe's sister, Kelly, to get to the station. And as he looked at photos of Olga laying by the front door and Joe laying several yards away in the bushes, he had a theory that he just couldn't shake. Leonard had spent the entire morning with Officer Richards and a few others combing the area around the condo, and a couple of things had stood out to him. The first was that the bushes where Joe's body had been found were littered with 9mm bullet casings. However, they also found .22 caliber casings on site, and the report Leonard had received from the hospital where Olga had been taken stated that her bullet wounds had come from a .22. Now, Leonard knew it was possible that the killer could have just had two different guns on them. But based on how far apart the bodies had been found, he thought it was more likely that there had been two shooters at the scene, one to kill Olga and one to kill Joe. And if that was the case, Leonard thought there was a good chance that these murders had been planned, and that they were not the result of some kind of spur-of-the-moment argument or anything like that. Detective Leonard's door opened, and an officer stepped inside. He told Leonard that Joe's sister Kelly had just arrived and was waiting in one of the interview rooms. Leonard put the crime scene photos back in a folder, put on his suit jacket, and then walked out of his office. Detective Leonard reached the interview room, went inside, and sat down at a table across from Kelly. And right away, his first impression was she looked like she hadn't slept all night. Joe and Olga's immediate families had all been informed about the murders, but since Olga's family was in Russia, Joe's parents and his two siblings were the ones dealing directly with the police. And Leonard knew that could take a toll on someone. So he started the interview with what he thought was a simple question. What was Kelly's relationship with her brother Joe like? But just hearing this question sent Kelly into a total breakdown. She began sobbing and she struggled to catch her breath. She said that she and Joe had actually been fighting and had stopped talking to each other. But now he was dead, and so she'd never get a chance to talk to him again. Detective Leonard just sat there quietly and let Kelly cry for a few minutes. As far as he could tell, Kelly was truly upset about the death of her brother. But Leonard also knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. When Kelly finally composed herself and said she was okay to continue, Detective Leonard laid everything out. He told her he knew about the burglary at Joe and Olga's condo, and he knew she, Kelly, had been interviewed by police in connection to that crime. He also assumed that that's why she and her brother had stopped talking to each other. But Kelly said no, that her and Joe had actually started fighting before all that. And then Kelly leaned forward and began telling her story. And as she did, Detective Leonard just sat there thinking, this sounds totally insane. Kelly told the detective that years ago, her mother had given her the most beautiful ring with a bunch of diamonds in it. The ring was a family heirloom, and her mom had wanted to pass it on to her only daughter. Kelly had treasured this ring and dreamed of it being her engagement ring someday. Then, a few months ago, Kelly's mother had asked if she could borrow the ring so she could wear it on a trip she was taking. Kelly said of course. After all, it had been her mother's ring for a long time before Kelly got it. However, when her mom had returned the ring, Kelly knew right away that something was wrong. The ring looked different. So, on a hunch, Kelly had brought the ring to a jeweler, and the jeweler said there were no diamonds in this ring. There were only cubic zirconias. Cubic zirconias are cheaper stones that are often used to imitate diamonds. Kelly told Detective Leonard that she'd been really confused at first. But pretty soon, everything clicked when she heard that Joe had given Olga this beautiful engagement ring with several diamonds in it. And so Kelly got in touch with Olga, wanting to know if those diamonds had come from her family heirloom ring. Olga had said she had no idea what Kelly was talking about, but it hadn't taken long for Kelly to get her mom and Joe to admit what they had done. They had taken the diamonds out of Kelly's ring when she lent it to her mother, put those diamonds in a new ring for Olga, and put cubic zirconias in the original, gave it back to Kelly, and just hoped Kelly wouldn't notice. At this point, Kelly stopped talking. And at first, Detective Leonard really didn't know what to say. This was like the plot twist of a heist movie or something. But he quickly got back on track. He asked point blank if Kelly had broken into Joe and Olga's condo to try to steal the diamonds back, or to steal other jewelry to get back at Joe for what he'd done. At this point, Kelly broke down again. She said she had nothing to do with the burglary. And as angry as she was, Joe was still her brother, and she loved him. Leonard wrapped up the interview by asking Kelly where she had been when Joe and Olga had been killed. And Kelly said she'd been home alone. She knew that was not a great alibi, but it was the truth. After the interview ended, Leonard considered Kelly to be a major suspect. But he didn't have any concrete evidence to hold her, so he had to let her go. The detective had not slept in a while, but he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. And after Kelly's crazy story, he wanted to talk to someone outside of the family about Joe, someone who would not have been mixed up in the family feud and who hadn't swiped any diamonds. So Leonard headed across town to Joe's auto repair shop. Later that afternoon, still not even 24 hours after Joe and Olga's bodies had been found, Detective Leonard walked across the parking lot of the auto repair shop that Joe had co-owned. He saw several mechanics hard at work on different cars, and he also saw a few guys who looked like they'd just come by the shop to hang out. They seemed a little strange to Leonard, but he didn't think too much about it. He walked into a small lobby, and he saw a man who looked like he was around 30 sitting behind the counter. Detective Leonard introduced himself and showed his badge, and the man behind the counter stood up. He said his name was Chris Rivers, and he asked if there was a problem. Leonard asked him if he knew who Joe Connell was. Immediately, Chris let out a big sigh, and a very annoyed look came across his face. He looked right at Leonard and said, "What did he do now?" This was not what the detective had expected. In fact, it really threw him off. Leonard had planned to come by the shop, learn a bit about Joe, and then leave. But now, he wondered if Chris might have information about something illegal Joe had been mixed up in. So, right there on the spot, Leonard changed his plan, and he asked Chris if he wouldn't mind coming to the station to answer some questions. The sun had begun to set by the time Detective Leonard and Chris sat down together inside of an interview room. Based on what Chris had said at the auto repair shop, it seemed like he had no idea Joe had been killed, and Leonard didn't tell him. Instead, the detective asked Chris what he did at the auto repair shop. Chris said he co-owned the place with Joe, but sometimes he felt like he was doing everything by himself. Leonard asked him to elaborate, and so Chris said, Joe seemed to like the idea of owning the business way more than actually running the business. Leonard smiled like he could relate, and he asked Chris if Joe's behavior upset him. Chris said of course it did. It was hard enough keeping the shop open, let alone profitable. But suddenly, Chris stopped talking and just stared at Detective Leonard. Chris realized he'd just started ranting and still had no idea why he was there. So he asked again, what had Joe done? At this point, Detective Leonard knew he had to tell Chris what was going on. So he said Joe hadn't done anything. Instead, someone had murdered Joe and his wife. Everything about Chris's demeanor immediately changed. His face went blank and he looked kind of pale. He started shaking his head. He said there was no way. Joe couldn't be gone. But Leonard said it was true. And right away, Chris got mad at himself. He couldn't believe he'd just trashed his best friend like that because of some stupid work stuff. Just like Leonard had done with Kelly, he let Chris sit there for a while and collect himself. Then at some point, when there was a lull, the detective asked Chris when the last time he had seen Joe was. Chris said he had seen Joe the day before at work. But after he said that, Chris suddenly paused like something had just hit him. He told Leonard somewhat emotionally that he was actually supposed to go to Olga's birthday party the night before, and he had gone to the restaurant, but when he was outside, he realized he had left his wallet back at the shop. He was already feeling annoyed that he'd had to work late, so instead of going to the party and seeing his friends one last time, he had just bailed, gotten his wallet, and headed home. And now he felt really bad about it. And so Detective Leonard asked a few follow-up questions about Chris's relationship with Joe and with Olga and how they met each other and things like that. And then eventually, Detective Leonard said he had just one more question for the time being. He asked Chris, when they had first met, why had he assumed Joe had done something that would have gotten him in trouble with the police. Chris took a breath and then said he had never told anyone this, but he knew that Joe was a big-time illegal steroid user. That's how he stayed in such great physical shape. However, Chris said over the past several months, Joe had gone from just using steroids to dealing them. In the days following the interview with Chris, Detective Leonard really started to dig into Joe's past, particularly his time in prison. Leonard and his team met with prison staff and people who'd been on the inside with Joe, and a lot of them said the same thing. When Joe was in prison, he had become very good friends with his cellmate, who was a member of a motorcycle gang called the Pagans. And Detective Leonard knew all about the Pagans. They were directly connected to the drug trade in Wilmington and in cities across the East Coast. So he wondered if maybe Joe had gotten mixed up with the gang after he had gotten out. Maybe he had made them angry, or took too much money on a drug deal and they retaliated. So Leonard methodically tracked down members of this gang and asked them if Joe Connell had been dealing drugs for them. Now, most of the members admitted to knowing Joe, but getting any information beyond that proved to be very difficult. This didn't surprise Leonard, because drug-dealing members of motorcycle gangs were not really known for talking to the police. But at the end of September, so about a week after the murders, Detective Leonard was sitting at his desk when an officer walked in with a strange look on his face. The door opened wider, and this huge, intimidating guy in a black leather jacket walked inside. And Detective Leonard couldn't believe it. because this man was one of the leaders of the pagans. The leader sat down and told the detective that he was not there to try to protect himself or anybody in the biker gang. He was just there to set the record straight. He said that Joe had been a very good friend, and he was still shocked that somebody had killed him, but he told the detective that Joe had absolutely nothing to do with any drug deals the pagans might be involved in. Joe was just a great mechanic who loved riding and working on motorcycles. Now, Detective Leonard knew how utterly bizarre it was that this man had, 1, chosen to set foot in the police station, 2, actually speak to a detective, and 3, not even try to hide the fact that he had connections to the drug world. And so by the time this leader left, Leonard couldn't help but feeling like he must be telling the truth. Still though, the detective was not ready to just drop the drug lead altogether. Leonard did think Joe's sister Kelly was still a major suspect, but Olga had been wearing her diamond ring when she was found, so this being some kind of a drug-related hit, as opposed to a robbery attempt, made more sense to him. And soon, as his team kept looking into Joe's past, they found a new drug-related lead. That lead was a man named Josh Bay. Josh was a known drug dealer in town, and he had even worked as an FBI informant. But for Detective Leonard, the most important thing about Josh was that he seemed to spend a lot of his free time just sort of hanging out at Joe's auto repair shop. On October 4th, 2 weeks after the murders, Detective Leonard brought Josh Bay in for an interview. But it quickly became clear that this young man was not going to be all that helpful. In fact, Josh at first tried to play off that he didn't even know Joe or his business partner Chris. When Leonard pointed out that police had plenty of evidence that said he did know both men, Josh simply changed his story. He admitted he knew Joe and Chris, but only as the guys who worked on his car. Leonard pressed Josh, but it got him nowhere. Josh said he knew nothing about drug deals involving anyone at the auto shop, and he said he had no connection to Joe and Olga's murders. The detective didn't really believe anything Josh said, but he'd have to find proof that Josh was lying. So Leonard let him go, frustrated that he had good leads, but no clear evidence pointing to any of them. The following day, October 5th, Detective Leonard and members of his team stood at the back of a church for Joe's funeral, listening to a man sing Danny Boy over Joe's casket. As Leonard listened to the song, he scanned the church pews, looking at everyone who had come. And one thing stood out. Most of Joe's friends and family clearly believed Joe's sister Kelly was involved in the murders. Because nobody was speaking to Kelly. It was like the entire family was shunning her. Even though Leonard had leaned into Joe's potential drug connections over the past weeks, he had not crossed Kelly off his suspect list by any means. If she wasn't the one who had pulled the trigger, she could have helped plan the hit. And maybe she didn't want to rob Olga's diamond ring or her other jewelry because she knew that would lead police right back to her. So, standing there in the church, watching Kelly stand there uncomfortably, Detective Leonard wondered if maybe the murders were just a classic case of revenge. Four days later, on the evening of October 9th, Detective Leonard and his team gathered around a TV at the station to watch a local news show. This was not something they did often, but tonight, the news was running a story on Joe and Olga that would include interviews with people who had been close to the couple. Just like going to the funeral, Detective Leonard saw this as an opportunity to see if anyone would say or do something strange. The news show started, and at first it was pretty standard. A retrospective on Joe and Olga's lives and how much people love them. But during one interview segment, Leonard heard something that took him completely by surprise. He looked around at his team to make sure he hadn't misheard something, but they had all caught it too. And they knew it could be something huge. After the news show ended, Leonard didn't waste any time. He laid out a new strategy to pursue what he thought might be the most important lead they'd gotten since the night of the murders. Leonard's team worked tirelessly, but it would still take a lot longer than Leonard had hoped for them to secure enough concrete evidence to put together a case that would hold up in court. But in September of 2014, 1 year after the murders, police finally made an arrest. Now they had a clear picture of who killed Joe and Olga and how they pulled it off. Based on details from that news show, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened outside of Joe and Olga's condo in the early morning of September 22, 2013. Around 1 a.m., the killers pulled their car into the condominium parking lot. They wore all black clothes and black gloves. The driver lifted their shirt, pulled a 9mm handgun from their waistband, and checked to make sure it was loaded. The passenger did the same with their .22. The killers scanned the parking lot and the surrounding area. It was well lit, but it was clear. Nobody was there. The driver nodded to the passenger, at which point the passenger stepped out of the car and quickly ran over to some bushes just a few yards away. The passenger crouched down, hid in the bushes, and kept their eyes fixed on Joe and Olga's front door. At the same time, the driver shut off the engine and sat in the car, waiting. About a half hour later, around 1:30 a.m., a car pulled into the parking lot. The driver could immediately feel themselves tense up. They looked out and saw a woman wearing a dress getting out of the car and heading up the walkway towards the front door, while a man followed shortly behind her. After a steadying breath, the driver gripped their 9mm and then stepped out of their car. And at that exact moment, right as Olga and Joe had reached the front door, the passenger leapt out of the bushes where they'd been hiding, sprinted towards Olga, and fired off 3 quick shots at her. The bullets struck Olga in the head, cheek, and upper back, and she immediately crumpled to the ground, covered in blood. Joe, who was right behind her, screamed in horror, but as he ran towards his wife, the driver unloaded their 9mm from right behind Joe. He got hit multiple times, but he actually stayed on his feet. Joe stumbled forward and tried to run to the bushes, looking for any way out of here, but the driver pursued him and kept firing their gun. Joe took rounds in the chest, arms, legs, and the back of his head. Finally, he hit the ground and died in the bushes. The driver ran back to the car and climbed inside. The passenger was already there, panting and trying to catch their breath. The driver started up the car, threw it in reverse, and peeled out of the lot. A few minutes later, when the killers were clear of the condo, the driver eased off the gas and told the passenger to let the person who had hired them know that the job was done. The 2 people who shot and killed Joe and Olga had no personal connection to them at all. They had simply been hired to do a job by Josh Bay, the drug dealer who had hung out at the auto repair shop. But Josh had also been hired by somebody else to carry out these murders. And the person who had hired Josh, and who was behind setting all of this up, was Joe's own best friend and business partner, Chris Rivers. For all of Chris's talk about Joe using and selling steroids, police discovered that it was actually Chris who appeared to have a major drug issue, with opioids and cocaine. And Chris's drug habit had begun to take a huge financial toll on him. He was basically burning through all his money. But Chris believed he had found a solution for all his problems. Chris and Joe had taken out a joint insurance policy for the auto repair business. Essentially, this policy would pay out a large lump sum to one owner and give that owner full control of the company if the other owner and any other beneficiaries died. This meant that to get the payout and to take sole control of the company, Chris would not only have to get rid of Joe, he would also have to get rid of Joe's possible beneficiary, Olga. So Chris reached out to his drug dealer, Josh Bay, for help. He offered Josh a cut of the insurance payout to murder Joe and Olga. But Josh had no intention of actually pulling the trigger himself, so he subcontracted the job out to 2 hired killers he knew from his work in the drug trade. On the night of Olga's birthday party, Chris texted Joe. He said he was finishing up something at work, but he wanted to know how late they'd be at the restaurant, because he still wanted to come to the party. Joe texted back that they would be there late, most likely until around closing time. Chris would pass that information on to Josh, and Josh would let the hired killers know so that they could be waiting at the condo when Joe and Olga got home. As Joe's business partner, Chris had been a suspect, but the bulk of the early investigation focused on Joe's sister Kelly and also on the possible drug angle with the Pagans motorcycle gang. But when Detective Leonard and his team watched the news show about Joe and Olga, they heard Chris say in an interview that on the night his two friends got killed, he had worked late and then gone straight home. This is not what Chris had originally told Detective Leonard. Chris had told Leonard that he had first driven to the restaurant for the birthday party, realized he'd forgotten his wallet, and then left and went home. This little change in Chris's story was like a massive alarm going off inside of Detective Leonard's head. So he and his team shifted their focus and dug deep into Chris's personal life and financial records, and they eventually discovered Chris's money problems, his drug habit, and his direct connection to the drug dealer, Josh Bay. Chris was charged with double homicide and found guilty, and he received 2 life sentences. Josh Bay got a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As for Joe's sister Kelly, despite her feud with her brother, she had nothing to do with the murders, and no evidence ever surfaced that she was at all involved in that burglary of Joe and Olga's condo. In the summer of 2001, Arthur Labe sat inside a traditional German beer garden with his family. The middle-aged man lived on Vancouver Island in Canada, where he worked as a house painter. But now he was on his dream vacation in Germany, visiting relatives that he hadn't seen for years. He'd been looking forward to this trip for ages, and he was having a total blast. Arthur felt grateful to be on this vacation at all. A few months earlier, he had coughed up some blood, and his wife Carol insisted that he go see their doctor on Vancouver Island. The doctor would tell Arthur that he was worried about lung cancer since Arthur had been a smoker when he was young. Thankfully, Arthur's chest x-rays and follow-up testing indicated he didn't have cancer, and his doctor said that it was fine for Arthur to go to Germany and enjoy his trip. And his cough actually cleared up completely a few days before he left for the trip. Arthur took a big swig of his beer and then thought about how great it felt to sit down and relax after a full day of walking all over the city. The walking was actually the only part of the trip that Arthur was not enjoying. They'd been on their feet so much that his lower back was starting to hurt. And so Arthur made a mental note to stop by a pharmacy on the way back to the hotel for some pain relievers or maybe a hot pad. Arthur took another big sip of his beer and then looked around at all the other tourists crowded into the beer garden. Then he nodded his head at the polka band in appreciation and then settled in, enjoying a sunny afternoon and the warm glow of a nice German beer. 2 hours later, the sun had sunk behind the trees, and Arthur stood up from the table to head back to the hotel. As he got to his feet, a shock of pain burst through his lower back. Arthur immediately sank back into his seat, very surprised. Then he tried to stand again, but every time he moved, a burning pain shot through his back and up his spine. Carol was surprised that her husband couldn't stand and asked what was wrong. Arthur told her he just needed to breathe for a second, but after a few minutes, the pain was still shooting up his back. And every time he tried to stand up, the pressure on his back was blinding. Finally, he just shook his head and told Carol he did need to go to the hospital. Something was going on with his back. She nodded, then asked their son-in-law, Brian, to run and grab their rental car. 15 minutes later, Arthur sat in the front passenger seat as Brian drove towards the hospital with Carol and Arthur's daughter, Jenny, in the back seat. Every time the car hit a bump, Arthur gritted his teeth in pain. Arthur could feel a brutal headache coming on too, and he wondered if the way he was feeling now had anything to do with that nasty cough he had back home. Finally, the car turned a corner, and Arthur saw the hospital up ahead, and not a moment too soon, because right at that moment, Arthur's vision had begun to blur, so he was leaning his head against the headrest and closing his eyes. He felt hot and achy, and his forehead was dripping with sweat, and by the time the car actually stopped, Arthur felt delirious. In fact, Arthur barely noticed as his car door opened and 2 hospital staff reached in to help him stand up. An hour later, Arthur opened his eyes and realized he was lying on his side in a hospital bed with an IV drip in his arm. Slowly, the beige room came into focus. He could hear the whirring and beeping of machines in the room, as well as conversations drifting in from the hallway. The room suddenly felt chilly, and Arthur hoped that his fever might be breaking. His headache was getting less intense too, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he felt like he could actually think clearly. Arthur looked down towards the foot of his bed, and he saw Carol speaking to a middle-aged doctor in a very quiet voice. When Carol noticed Arthur was awake, she smiled at him, but Arthur knew his wife well, and he knew the look she was giving him was her putting on a very brave face. Something clearly was wrong. At this point, the doctor turned to Arthur and introduced himself as Dr. Gent. He told Arthur that while he was unconscious, they'd performed a spinal tap so they could examine his spinal fluid for potential infections, and the lab work had just come back. Dr. Gent kept a neutral expression as he told Arthur that his spinal fluid had a high white blood cell count, which indicated that his body was fighting an infection. Dr. Gent suspected that Arthur had a very serious condition called bacterial meningitis, which meant that the membranes that protected his brain and spinal column were swelling. He explained that meningitis is a potentially life-threatening infection, but they had already started Arthur on antibiotics, so he should make a full recovery. Arthur felt overwhelmed by everything the doctor was saying, and he just wanted to know how long it was going to be before he felt better again. But before he could ask any questions, Dr. Gent told him to try and rest. He was going to be in the hospital for a few days at least. A week later, Arthur's daughter, Jenny, was getting ready to go to work on Vancouver Island. Jenny had decided to fly back to Canada while her father was still in the hospital, but she couldn't stop worrying about him. So far, doctors in Germany had tried 6 different antibiotics, but her dad didn't respond to any of them. He just kept getting sicker. Jenny was about to head out the door when her phone rang. She lunged for it, knowing it was the time her mother usually called from Germany. For a split second, Jenny hoped that her mom was calling to say her dad was all better, and they were just going to resume their vacation and everything was great. But as soon as Jenny picked up the phone, she could hear that her mom was crying. Carol told Jenny that the swelling in her father's brain was getting worse, and now Dr. Gent was saying that it looked like her father was going to die. Jenny had not prepared herself for the possibility of losing her dad, and she scrambled to think of some way she could help. Finally, she offered to drive over to her dad's doctor's office here on Vancouver Island to basically fill in Arthur's primary care doctor about what was going on, to see if maybe he had some ideas that the doctors in Germany had not tried yet. An hour later, Jenny fidgeted as she watched her father's doctor in Vancouver Island review her dad's scans on a computer monitor and flip through his lab results. He asked Jenny a few questions about her dad's condition, and she did her best to fill in the blanks. Finally, the doctor closed the files and turned to her, and she sat up expectantly. But he just shook his head and told Jenny that, despite her father's serious illness, his charts looked remarkably normal. The doctor told her that her dad was in good health when he left for Germany. He might have picked up a bug while on the trip, but his infection should be responding to antibiotics by now. Jenny begged the doctor to please just look one more time, and then Jenny held her breath as the doctor did pick up the lab results and looked them over one more time. Then Jenny noticed the doctor's expression change, like something had just occurred to him. Then he leaned in and he told Jenny there was one possible but highly unlikely explanation. Jenny asked him to please tell her. At this point, her family was willing to consider anything. So the doctor explained that several weeks ago, her father's blood work had shown no signs of lung cancer, and they had rejoiced. But lost in the excitement was some less positive news. Arthur's blood had tested positive for a fungal infection called Cryptococcus. A lot of people get Cryptococcus, which had existed on Vancouver Island for years, but it's usually harmless, and most people's immune systems fight it off easily. It's only dangerous for people with compromised immune systems. And Arthur's immune system at the time was fine, so the doctor didn't even tell Arthur that he had this fungal infection. Jenny asked if this fungus could cause meningitis, and the doctor nodded, but only in extremely rare cases. However, if her father's meningitis was caused by a fungal infection, he would need completely different medications than what he was receiving in Germany right now. Antibiotics cannot stop a fungal infection. If Jenny's father had fungal meningitis, that would mean that for the past few days, the treatments Arthur was receiving in Germany were doing nothing. Jenny tried to stay calm as the doctor placed a call to the hospital in Germany. If they started Arthur on antifungal medication right now, he might survive. Jenny just hoped they weren't too late. Several months later, in the early winter of 2002, An animal pathologist named Sally Lester was in her laboratory on mainland British Columbia, a few miles away from Arthur's home. She slid a glass slide under her microscope, then bent down over the eyepiece to take a look. The slide she had put under there contained tissue from the carcass of a dead porpoise that had washed up on the beach on nearby Vancouver Island. Dr. Lester focused her lens on a tiny cell that looked like a boiled egg. This kind of cell had become a familiar sight to her over the past year. These odd egg-shaped cells had been sent to Dr. Lester from veterinary clinics all around Vancouver Island. A growing number of sick dogs and cats were showing up at vet clinics with shortness of breath and discharge running from their noses. In more serious cases, the animals were having seizures. Some had mysterious lumps on their heads, and all of the animals had pockets of pus called abscesses below their eyes. Veterinarians had sent in samples of the abscess tissue to Dr. Lester so she could examine them in her lab, and every time she'd found these little yellow cells that looked like boiled eggs. She knew what the cells meant, that the animals were infected with Cryptococcus, a fungus that grew on Vancouver Island. It was common for animals and humans alike to contract Cryptococcus by inhaling the spores floating in the air. Humans and animals rarely got sick from these spores. In fact, Dr. Lester usually saw no more than maybe 6 to 10 animals with Cryptococcus infections in a year. But recently, vets on Vancouver Island had been sending her about 10 cases every single month. Dr. Lester was stumped about what could be causing the number of these infections to rise so quickly. Then, porpoises began washing up on shore, which had given Dr. Lester a very eerie feeling. Dead porpoises should rarely wash ashore, but now it was happening every few weeks. And when she began reading the porpoise autopsy reports, she started feeling even more unnerved. The porpoise's lungs had been riddled with inflammation from pneumonia. Their organs were swollen and covered in flower-like tumors. And now, as Dr. Lester looked at the slide, she realized that all this damage was being caused by a Cryptococcus infection. The porpoise's blood was loaded with the fungus. Dr. Lester sat back on her stool, feeling a knot starting to form in her gut. She knew how porpoises would have contracted the Cryptococcus spores. Since spores are airborne, the fungus would have floated out over the ocean and settled on top of the water. The porpoises would have inhaled the spores when they came up and broke the surface to breathe. What she didn't understand was why the number of cases was increasing now. Something weird was definitely going on. And then Dr. Lester had a chilling thought. If more animals are getting fungal infections, maybe more people are too. After all, we all breathe the same air. Dr. Lester picked up the phone to call the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. She knew it was now time to get the human infectious disease authorities involved. Half an hour later, Dr. Murray Fife hung up the phone on his desk at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. He was the organization's head epidemiologist, and he had been absolutely swamped lately. And now, after speaking with Dr. Lester, he needed a moment to consider what she had told him about this potential outbreak of fungal infections on Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wanted to get feedback on Dr. Lester's concerns from a colleague who lived on Vancouver Island. So he picked up the phone again, this time to call the Vancouver Island Health Authority. The microbiologist who picked up said very matter-of-factly that Dr. Lester was right. There was a definite increase in human Cryptococcus infections on Vancouver Island, but not among the patients they would normally expect. Usually, it was just people with compromised immune systems that got sick from Cryptococcus, but lately, healthy adults were getting sick from the fungus. It was bizarre and basically unheard of. It made no sense to Dr. Fife. Cryptococcus fungus had been on Vancouver Island for years, so why was it suddenly so dangerous now? He worried that something about the fungus itself was changing, and he wondered if it could even be stopped. A few days later, Dr. Fife sat in a conference room totally surrounded by piles of hospital records and feeling completely exhausted. For the last week, he and a scientist at the University of British Columbia named Karen Bartlett had been combing the region's hospital records in hopes of finding other Cryptococcus infections. His eyes hurt from hours spent reading, but they still had not figured out when the number of infections had begun to rise. Dr. Bartlett cleared her throat and looked up while holding a file above her head. Dr. Fife raised his eyebrows as she explained that this file, was the oldest human case she'd found. It was from over 2 years ago, the beginning of 1999. The patient had been in good health when Cryptococcus made her sick, just like a lot of the recent cases. A few minutes later, Dr. Bartlett gasped and handed Dr. Fife another file. It was the medical records of a lively 45-year-old mother who had started to feel lousy just a few months ago in the fall of 2001. By the time the doctors tested her for Cryptococcus, the fungus had infected her brain and she died shortly after. Dr. Fife was shocked. He'd never heard of Cryptococcus killing an otherwise healthy adult. Even Arthur Labe, who'd been on death's door in Germany last summer, he'd recovered from his infection after receiving antifungal treatment. Suddenly, the stakes in their investigation seemed much higher. Not only were healthy adults contracting Cryptococcus, but the fungus was now, apparently, deadly, and Dr. Fife had no idea why. A week later, Dr. Fife was back at his desk, feeling both amazed and horrified at the unfolding health crisis. After he and Dr. Bartlett discovered that Cryptococcus infections were killing people on Vancouver Island, they'd sent samples of the fungus to a lab for further analysis. And now Dr. Fife was staring at the test results, and they weren't at all what he expected. The fungus that was infecting the animals and the people on Vancouver Island was an entirely new kind of Cryptococcus fungus than what had been on Vancouver Island for years. Under the microscope, analysts could tell that the new Cryptococcus was a completely different species from what residents were used to. But the new strain should never have been in Vancouver Island. The newcomer strain of Cryptococcus is typically found in the bark of eucalyptus trees in Australia and other warm places. It had never been seen so far north, and especially not in a cold and damp climate like Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wondered how a tropical fungus got so far north. There were hardly any eucalyptus trees on Vancouver Island, which meant that Dr. Fife had no idea where the fungus was hiding, or how it could even survive in this environment. Dr. Fife called Dr. Bartlett to explain the alarming lab results and admit he had no idea how to find this toxic new fungus. She paused, then told him she had an idea. She said it was time to get some boots on the ground. A week later, Dr. Bartlett stood on a residential street on Vancouver Island, surrounded by several students from a local college. These were her volunteers, and together they were going to comb the backyards and backwoods of all of Vancouver Island, searching for answers. Dr. Bartlett looked from student to student and reminded them of their objective. They would dig up soil samples and swab tree barks in the hopes that they would capture the new strain of Cryptococcus in the wild. Each student nodded and said they understood. So Dr. Bartlett divided them into teams. She sent 2 teams to collect samples around the neighborhood. Then she led her group to the first house on the street where the owner was expecting them. Dr. Bartlett was pleased to see that the homeowner, who was a middle-aged woman with tanned and sun-worn skin, was waiting in the garage. Dr. Bartlett waved as she and her volunteers walked up the driveway, and the woman led them around into her backyard. Dr. Bartlett had selected this house for a very specific reason. The homeowner, the woman, had survived a recent Cryptococcus infection. Dr. Bartlett hoped that the fungus might be found somewhere in this woman's immediate environment, but failing that, Dr. Bartlett thought that by interviewing this woman and other survivors, once she knew what they all had in common, she could use that information to track down the source of the fungus. Dr. Bartlett nodded to the students, and they fanned out into the backyard. She watched as they stooped over flower beds and scraped bark off trees, and while the students went to work, Dr. Bartlett interviewed the woman who lived there. Dr. Bartlett asked the woman where she went on a daily basis, and the woman listed off popular nature trails she liked to hike, beaches she frequented, and also the friends and family that she visited most often. Eventually, Dr. Bartlett had asked all her questions, so she thanked the woman for helping and then tucked her notes into her satchel. Then, once all her students were done taking their samples, Dr. Bartlett led them down the street to the next house on their list. A few days later, Dr. Bartlett sat in a conference room at the British Columbia CDC, going over her notes while she waited for Dr. Fife. Dr. Bartlett was feeling frustrated. After canvassing what seemed like the entirety of Vancouver Island, none of the samples that she or her volunteers had collected had come back positive for spores of this new type of Cryptococcus. and her interviews with all these survivors had led nowhere too. The only thing the infected people on her list had in common was that they all lived on Vancouver Island, which of course made it impossible to pinpoint where the spores were actually coming from. They could be anywhere on the island. A few moments later, Dr. Fife walked into the office with a grim look on his face. He told Dr. Bartlett that somebody else had just shown up at a Vancouver Island hospital with a Cryptococcus infection, which brought the total of people infected to 30 so far. Dr. Bartlett had this nagging sense that the situation, which was already bad, could actually still get much worse. The summer of 2002 was approaching, and she was worried that there could be an explosion of cases as the weather got warmer. She stood and began pacing the room, racking her brain for ideas. Dr. Fife leaned against the doorframe, scratching his chin. But then Dr. Bartlett stopped pacing. She turned to Dr. Fife and asked if he'd be up for a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights. He laughed a little because he always did late nights and they always worked all the time, but Dr. Bartlett could tell, he was up for more. So Dr. Bartlett explained what she had in mind. Since her interviews with infected people had failed to get the information they needed, she suggested they start talking to the owners of infected pets. There were so many animal cases that there might be an overlap in the animals' daily schedules. It was a long shot, but there was a chance that it would help them pinpoint where the fungus spores were coming from. Dr. Fife nodded and asked Dr. Bartlett if she'd like some coffee. If they were going to spend the next few weeks driving all over Vancouver Island, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of pet owners, they would need a lot more caffeine.
Leave behind the broken road, onward to a brighter coat. Every step a chance to grow. Now it's time to let it show. Hey now, it's a brand new day. All the pain has washed away. Feel the future in our hands, building dreams on solid lands. Hey now, it's a brand new day. All the pain has washed away. Feel the future in our hands, building dreams on solid lands.
A week later, Dr. Bartlett climbed out of her car and knocked on the door of a house on Vancouver Island. A broad-shouldered woman with big brown eyes answered the door, and Dr. Bartlett followed her into the kitchen. This was the 24th pet owner that Dr. Bartlett had interviewed in person, so at this point, she basically had her questions memorized. She began by asking where the pet owner regularly took her dog. And the woman gave predictable answers, like hiking trails and restaurants and friends' houses. Except this time, the broad-shouldered woman also mentioned a place called Rathtrevor Beach Provincial Park. That name stuck with Dr. Bartlett through the rest of the interview because other pet owners had mentioned it as well, and so Dr. Bartlett felt like that place might be worth looking into. About 36 hours later, Dr. Bartlett met her student volunteers at Rathtrevor Beach and told them to swab everything. And 2 weeks after submitting those samples, Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Fife had a startling realization. Fir trees all over Rathtrevor Beach tested positive for the new deadly fungus, and so the air in this park contained huge quantities of spores. And once Dr. Fife and Dr. Bartlett looked into this park further, the explanation for why this was became clear. Because of its location, the weather at Rathtrevor Beach was unlike the rest of Vancouver Island. It was warmer and enjoyed a drier, more Mediterranean climate. In other words, it was the perfect place for a fungus that prefers the warm, dry air of Australia rather than the typically chilly and wet Canada. So anybody who stopped at that park or just lived near it would have been breathing in these spores day in and day out. And most of the people who had contracted this infection were eventually found to have gone into or near this park. In the summer of 2002, Dr. Fife posted signs at Rathtrevor Beach Park warning people about the danger posed by this fungus. However, the park was not closed because Dr. Bartlett and her students eventually found spores in several other spots on Vancouver Island as well. So they realized there was really no way to actually contain the outbreak because clearly it basically had spread all around the island. Between 1999 and 2006, 165 human cases of Cryptococcus infections were reported in British Columbia. In total, 8 people died. As for Arthur Labe, he recovered from the disease once his hospital in Germany put him on that antifungal medication, and he was ultimately able to return to work, but his wife Carol says he's not quite as active as he used to be. Nobody knows how this fungus arrived on Vancouver Island, but the spores can live on surfaces for many, many years. So it could have been transported by humans, or wind currents coming up from the tropics, or even by porpoises that migrated across the ocean. Today, scientists are still working to find a way to prevent this infection, but currently, most scientists think there's really nothing we can do until humans and animals just naturally develop immunity to the disease. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.